On today's show.
And I knew that at that time the $50 was the price of a cap of heroin.
This podcast is recommended for listeners over the age of 18 years. It contains content that some may find distressing, including but not limited to themes of death, abuse, violence, murder, self-harm and missing persons.
Welcome to What Are We Looking At? A podcast about the true crime cases of retired Detective Valentine Smith. I'm Private Investigator Samantha. Like and subscribe to our channel for exclusive content. Welcome back, listeners, to episode 3 of What Are We Looking At? So, Val, tell us about the porn star and a cap of heroin.
All right, the sad girl. One day in Paran. This episode is just one small case in the day in the life of a dealer squad detective, which is where I worked for about 3 years. Now, the dealer squad was set up many years ago to work the second-hand dealers and gold buyers, collectors, pawnbrokers. And when I say pawnbrokers, I'm talking about the ones that buy pawn goods. Mm-hmm. Basically, anyone who dealt in second-hand goods. Now, the arrest rate of the squad was the highest in the state of Victoria. You could go out at any time of the day and catch crooks. However, in the late 1980s, the Victoria Police, for some reason, decided to decentralise the responsibility to divisional detectives across the state. Now, most of the time, the detectives went out, and the detective sergeant who was in charge, Bill Perry, we changed the names, as I always do, but Bill Perry stayed back to look after the office and the paperwork. But often he would come out either to get out of the office or to lead a bigger operation. And occasionally he and I would go out together doing a round of the pawn shops. And I think it kept the pawnbrokers on their toes to be paid a visit by the boss. Mm. And he was a very good detective who knew most of what there was to know about crooks. And on this one occasion, Bill and I hit the pawn shops in Chapel Street, Paran, in Melbourne suburb of Paran, which is a pretty busy area. Mm. And it was pretty late in the day, and we didn't have much time, and the traffic was jammed, and there was nowhere for us to park. So instead of checking the usual shops, we tried a jewellery and coin buyer at the South Yarra end of town, near the restaurants. Mm. And when I cast my eye casually through the dealer's book, I noticed one name appeared 3 times in the week. Mm. And it was a girl's name, a female name. And she'd popped in 3 lots of jewellery for $50 a go. She had used 2 different addresses. And I knew that at that time that $50 was the price of a cap of heroin.
Right.
So I quizzed the dealer for the name, and he couldn't tell me much, probably because he didn't want to. And this was the thing about the dealer squad. He had enough sense to know that if he held back too much, and I found out, he'd run the risk of attracting much more attention than he could handle. And we'd put pressure on him, and it would affect his license. Mm. So after much deliberation and a few what-ifs about that from me, he suddenly recalled that she was coming back the next morning to pawn some more gear. Mm-hmm. So the shop opened at 10 the next morning, and Bill and I returned, and we parked the wagon downwind, so to speak, mm-hmm. and walked back. And Bill and I, we'd worked together fairly frequently in those weeks because the squad was light on for detectives due to leave and a sticky trial that had been running for about a month. And that's the problem with trials. When you've got 2 or 3 detectives involved in the one trial, you lose them. They sit around the court for the whole duration of the trial. Mm. It was a funny thing about when I was working with a boss, we always seemed to catch crooks, which, well, you know, in the dealer squad, you just fell over crooks. But with him, they were invariably females. Mm. And he thought it was me. And whenever there was a hiccup in the case, he'd break out with some sort of pretentious anxiety attack. And he'd say with a sigh, you know, you and your women, you know, there's always a hard luck or a tragic story behind each of the people, you know. We set everything up. Bill gave an Academy Award-winning performance showing an interest in the contents of the pawn shop window whilst he was outside. And at the same time, he was eating a bag of continental cakes looking in the window. And I spent about an hour inside studying cabinets full of coins and foreign banknotes. Anyway, this girl fronted about 11 a.m. And I got the nod from the pawnbroker as soon as she entered the little shop. I gave her a casual glance as she walked to the counter, and then I continued checking out the coins. And her back was towards me as she continued her business, and I moved slowly closer to see and hear what was happening. And I judged her aged about 25, but she was well dressed in a grey raincoat, very stylish raincoat. And she had a tartan scarf, and I thought she had to have a habit. Drug habit. She was too well dressed to be a career villain, And I could hear everything they were saying. She appeared nervous, agitated. She's very well spoken. The pawnbroker was so bloody unnatural. And I thought she's going to sense that she's being set up, But she didn't. She spoke softly and she was straight to the point. And there was an economy of dialogue on what she had to say. She dropped this brown paper bag full of trendy silver jewelry onto the counter, and she just said, "I want $50 for this." Very softly spoken, "I want $50 for this." The pawnbroker flicked through the pile in seconds and stood back looking at it with a one raised eyebrow and sort of putting his right hand to his face, rubbing his chin, trying to put on a pathetic gesture of intended indecision. And I was getting increasingly impatient with the scene, gave him a determined look of, "I'm going to kick your backside in a minute. It's going to cost you $200 stare," some sort of regulatory fine or something. It triggered him into action. And he pulled out the purchaser's book. And when he did that, it seemed to ease the young woman as she spoke again, as if to convince the pawnbroker that he was making a sound decision. She said, "I don't want to sell it. I just need $50 to pay a bill." And the poor thing, I thought, she's got a drug habit and it's going to turn her into a hag. She'll be working the parlours within 12 months and she'll be on the streets prostituting inside 5 years, I moved over next to her and whilst pretending to show an interest in a medal collection that was there under the counter, I took a quick glance at what she was writing in the purchaser's book. And I instantly saw that once more she'd used a different address. If you put false entries in these books, it's an offence under the Second-Hand Dealers Act. So she pocketed the $50. She walked quickly out the door. She was totally preoccupied with a purpose that she would not have noticed a troop of mounted police if they'd been forming a guard of honour. Really. She wouldn't notice anything. I gave the nod to Bill. He stopped her on the footpath outside. Within seconds, I was there. He'd already asked her for ID. As she turned towards me, her forehead sort of crumpled with that theatrical puzzlement of, "What's all this about? I don't understand. What am I supposed to have done?" That sort of look. And as she spoke, I could sense her sort of veiled anxiety, fear. I've seen it so many times before. She was done. She'd cracked quickly. Always first there comes that indignation, then that emotional collapse, and then finally remorse. So they put up that wall of offence and argument. "What, not me? Don't accuse me first," and then they collapse. So I spoke to her in a sort of very casual, confident tone and said, "Well, the way I see it, we've got a problem here." And she snapped back at me instantly. "You might have a problem," she said, "but I certainly don't." And I looked her straight in the eye and smiling, I said, "Well, it's against the law to give a false name when you pawn goods, and you've done it 3 times. It makes me awful suspicious when people give false names. And each one of those is an offence." She said, "Oh, I didn't realise," tried to explain. "I just didn't want anybody to know I was in need of money. The whole thing's so embarrassing. I haven't done anything wrong. Please let me go." All this sort of pleading things. I said, "Well, whose jewellery is it?" And I knew the next answer would undoubtedly be another lie. She said, "It's all mine. I didn't want to sell it. I just needed the money to pay the rent. My flatmate's overseas and he didn't leave any money for his share of the rent." Well, if this girl wore that jewellery, then my English ancestors all wore caftans. The jewellery was totally out of character to her. These are the observations that you make. She was a well-dressed, conservative-looking type of young lady, and this jewellery was straight out of a Bohemian bazaar. She looked nervously and she fumbled with the strap of her handbag, and I gave her a firm invitation to accompany us back to police headquarters. The ride, the ride back to town was pretty well uneventful. She hardly spoke. She just looked out of the window, fidgeting. We didn't speak much on the way back into the city. The old police headquarters at Russell Street, you used to go in through this sort of big cream brick portal of the old crime department headquarters. There's always a look of defeat as they go through those portal, as I said. As they went through that, there was a look of defeat, and I could see her eyes took on a watery glaze and a worried frown as she went through that entranceway. Mm. Once we settled in the office, I eased the interrogation along slowly, and my instincts told me that she would eventually tip in a pretty tragic tale, and it might take a little time, but it'd be worth it. Mm. And I felt that she was just as much a victim as was the owner of the jewellery, whoever that was. Mm. Anyway, the details sort of trickled out slowly, and once I had her confidence in me, that is, she began to talk. It was as I expected. It was very sad sort of story. Anyway, it wasn't long before I learned that there was a globe-trotting flatmate, and that was her boyfriend, as far as she was concerned, that is. And that he picked her up at a disco about 6 months previously and quickly introduced her to heroin. Mm. And the boyfriend, as it turned out, I knew of him. He was a drug dealer who already featured in our personal top 10 names of villains. Mm. Consultation sort of revealed that he was on an alleged holiday somewhere in the Middle East. Mm. We'd check his movements later through customs, but in the meantime I was preoccupied with the origin of the pawn jewellery. The young woman hesitantly told me that she'd stolen the jewellery from her best friend. Mm. And she said that as soon as she could raise the money, she intended to redeem it from the pawnbroker, which both she and I knew that would never happen. Mm. She'd actually climbed in through an open window on two or three occasions to get this jewellery. Mm. The story about redeeming it was just applied in an attempt to lessen the guilt. So it was a self-imposed, unachievable goal. Mm. She had a raging drug habit and no money to appease it. Mm-hmm. As she spoke, her voice softened, inset with an occasional sob. This girl came from a solid family background, good home, private school education, loyal friends. In her own way, she'd left home and that sort of quality, lifestyle and home life as a teenager on a quest for the fast life. Mm-hmm. We've all seen it so many times. Anyway, one night at a Paran disco, looking for the other side of life, the action side, she met the boyfriend and his exotic ways and incredible good looks that instantly charmed her. Mm. At first, very slowly, he introduced her to hash and amphetamines. And once she acquired the need for more, he quickly shifted it to heroin. Mm. And it wasn't long before she was so hopelessly addicted to the killer drug. Very soon she was expected to give special favours to his special friends in exchange for her ration of powder. Mm. Now, ordinarily, when he went away, the boyfriend would leave her a sufficient supply of heroin, but this time he'd gone longer than expected, and he hadn't allowed for the escalation of her habit. Mm. So, out of her necessity and desperation, she knew the only crime could provide her with the quick cash to buy the drugs she needed. She tried one attempt at street prostitution. That didn't work. She just wasn't in the game, so to speak. Mm. So one afternoon, well aware of the movements of her best friend, she climbed in through a bedroom window and stole the assortments of jewellery she knew was there. It didn't matter, she'd assured herself. No one would suspect her, and insurance would make good the loss. Mm. And the mention of redemption of the jewellery from the pawnbroker was only a ruse applied in an attempt to allay the pawnbroker's thoughts that he might have of her owning it. Mm. So I was sort of feeling sorry for the woman. She could have had all she wanted out of life. And I could see that she knew that she'd hit the bottom. There was no argument. There was no defiance. Life's frequently unkind to many people, victims of fate or circumstances or even ignorance. We all walk the razor edge of life towards success. If we fail, we fall. Mm. And inevitably, we get cut to pieces. If we manage to climb back up to the edge, it's not without pain and suffering. I tried to help the woman. I arranged legal aid through a very kind and understanding solicitor to mend the damage a bit. And I'll never forget the day the case came to court. She walked to the courtroom with the solicitor, who was a good guy, and she was sitting there quietly in the courtyard, dressed the same, in a fashionable, gentle sort of way, quietly in the courtyard, reading a book while she was waiting for the case, amongst this raucous mass of tattoos, cops and lawyers, all milling around. And here's this one lady sitting quietly on the end of a bench reading a book.
Mm.
Now, to her, I suppose it was the worst day of her life, but to the hundreds of others there, that day, her problem was of no interest. I know it might seem strange that she's reading a book. She was just quiet, quiet person.
Mm.
The case is over in 10 minutes. Quick plea of guilty, a flurry of eloquence from the solicitor, one single tired sentence of pity from the magistrate, done. And in those days, you just scrawl a few marks quickly on the brief, throw it on top of a pile on the floor, and it's all over. All done. And she thanked me very much. She got a good behaviour bond, which was inevitable. She'd never been in trouble before, left the court. All over, Sam. No, it wasn't, because I thought she's been given a second chance and she can retrace her steps and start a new life. No, it wasn't going to be like that. I was sitting in the squad room quite a while later, and the telephone rang. I suppose I'd been sitting with my feet up in the old battered desk for about an hour. This was weeks later. I remember sitting there. All the other detectives had gone. I was on my own. We'd been having a big week. And the phone rang. I picked up, and the woman on the phone spoke softly. She was elderly, a senior voice. And she was slowly hesitating now and then to sigh quietly before continuing. And the dialogue was logical and informative. And I could feel this lady's grief, even though she was displaying a sort of a disciplined control of what she said. And I suspected that she prepared the call, rehearsing it many times before she could satisfy that she could handle it. I didn't say much. What does anyone say to a mother that's telling you that her only daughter committed suicide yesterday? You can't say much. You just sort of feel for the other person. You want to sort of cry for them, but you could never say the right thing. You just don't say anything. You just worry afterwards that you just don't show enough. So what they say about cops, we've hardened to. We have no feeling, no compassion anymore. I always remember that case. I should have picked up on it, that quiet, melancholy dignity about that girl. Should have picked up on it. She was the only child of that woman. Gone.
If you had have noticed at the time, what could you have done? I'm assuming this was quite a few decades ago, this case. Was there community support that you could have veered her in the direction of, or what sort of substantial input could you have really had other than to soothe her at the time, perhaps? It sounds like that woman was in some sort of state of sadness. What do you think that you could have done differently should you have noticed it in time?
I think it's another one of those cases where that was in the 80s. And there would have been some sort of counselling services available somewhere. Where, I don't know. But back then, we were sort of process driven. The dealer squad was one of the busiest squads from an arrest perspective in the police force. Every time we went out, we arrested crooks. We just kept catching them. And it's all about communication and knowing the signs, reading the signs, reading the communications of what's going on. It's wonderful, the benefit of hindsight. And it's wonderful sitting back as an old man, and I can look at the cases that I've dealt with, so many more offenders that I've dealt with, so many more victims that I've dealt with, where suicide's been involved, many which I won't even know about. But there's some signs there that even just sitting in that courtroom reading a book, that's a sign. Her whole demeanour was a sign. The way she presented herself, the profile that she put forward was a sign. There was some work to be done there. How she perhaps got herself into the situation that she was in the first place. I've seen it many times since. A lot closer than a lot of other people. To answer your question, what could I have done back then? There were all sorts of things, but Was I aware of what I could have done back then? Probably not.
Mm. And this tragedy is a long-standing problem, not just in terms of people trying to escape their realities with drugs, but that sense of them feeling lost, feeling unsupported, feeling that they don't have anyone or anything to turn to. And time again, you hear stories from people who consume drugs for a long time. People speak about the reasons why they chose that path. And it usually is when they have, from their point of view, exhausted all other avenues and they're just at an absolute loss. It's such a complicated situation for every individual as to why they end up there. We absolutely could be doing more from a community point of view, from a family point of view, and just from a human point of view, considering people, not making assumptions. I think that there is absolutely more that we could be getting done. If I had the answer, that would be amazing. I absolutely am not claiming that I do. When you say there's plenty of things that you could have done, what do they actually look like? You don't even have to necessarily reference this one particular case. I just mean from a policing point of view or from just a human point of view, what could you have done for that woman?
You can only offer options.
Mm.
You can offer suggestions.
Mm.
And if you could take 10 people that you could offer suggestions to, I wouldn't expect that you would have 10 successes.
Mm.
But as a young constable, as a young detective, were there situations where some people did take the options and the suggestions? Yes, there were.
Mm.
But I never made any suggestions to that young woman. I referred her to a solicitor who was more than just a solicitor. He was a community-based legal aid solicitor who was very, very much focused on support as well. You know, could I have done more? Could have made more suggestions and more offers, but I didn't. Would it have made any difference? I don't know.
Mm. And I suppose that's what it comes down to. People can offer suggestions, support, many forms of help, but unless the individual is actually seeking hope, they can't see that those offers, support, or services exist. And that's the real crucial part of this discussion. How could we be presenting these offers in a better way so that the person that we're trying to suggest these offers to actually receives it in the light that we're trying to present it? And I think that a lot of the time that's the actual failure. I don't think you could say that any particular person is at fault here. It's more about how communication between humans is often delivered in the way that the person that's delivering it is trying to make sense of it, rather than thinking about the person that's trying to receive it. And I think that that's still quite a big downfall in communication as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, you and I know a number of people that are fantastic mentors or role models as far as cases are concerned where hope, you use the word hope, can be seen where they've actually showed that you can make it. Over the horizon, there is hope that you can get shot of that drug habit. You can get shot of all that hopelessness, and that you can turn your life around and turn it into a fantastic life. It is possible. It's okay for you and I to say that, but there are people out there that have done it. But for many, they see that there is no hope.
Absolutely. And as a society, they're the people that we need to focus on. Not to say that they're any more important than anyone else, but they are the ones that we need to learn how to reach. I think it's very important that people who have lived experience, like in your situation, have interacted with people who have ended up dying by suicide. You don't hold on to guilt. It shows how much you cared for that person or how much you could see that that person was struggling. But I don't think it serves anyone well to hold on to that element of guilt for feeling as though you needed to save that person.
It's part of something you learn along the way, and you make adjustments as a result of that learning
Mm.
in your thinking. You'll have successes, and sadly in life there will be casualties.
If you or someone you know has found this content distressing and needs support, please contact Lifeline, Beyond Blue, or the Suicide Callback Service. For more information about who we are and what we do, please visit www.missingsinaustralia.com.au. Till next time.